Welcome back, everybody. We are going to go ahead and finish this closed form jar. So stick around and see how we do it. So before we can separate the lid from the base, we got to center the piece directly on the wheel head. Now you can just center it by hand by pushing and pulling until it's centered and then getting wads and then wadding it down. Or you can do the water tension method, which is the one that I prefer with something like this. Now, if it's your first time doing the water tension method, you may want to do it on a piece so you're not too worried about it flying off, because it can still pop off. But to do it, all you do is get your sponge and get your piece and get some water on your sponge. Add a little bit of water onto the metal wheel head, and then add a little bit of water on the bottom of your piece to get it kind of shiny and tacky. And then you take the piece, you put it on top, and you start moving it around. Now as you move it around, it creates slip. And as the slip gets thicker, your piece will get harder and harder to move. The moment you stop your piece, it's going to more or less get stuck. So you want to try your best to get as close to center as possible before you fully release the piece, or it's going to be hard to budge. So to get this piece centered once it's more or less stuck, you want to center it based on the lid, the belly, or the base. And for this particular piece, I recommend the belly. So I take my thumb, place it where the belly is, and as the wheel spins, I find where it touches. The moment it touches the belly, that is the point that it's the most off-centered. Then I take that point, shift it into the middle of my body, and I gently try to push it away. Now, using the water tension technique, it can be hard to shift because it is very stuck. So you see me, you had to tense my muscles to get it to shift. So that's how stuck this thing is. So centering does become a little more difficult because you're really going to have to push it into center. So you just want to make sure that your piece is dry enough where you can apply a good amount of pressure to the outside of the piece so that you end up not denting it. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now it does look a little off on the camera. You can kind of see it moving, but I'm not too worried about it. On the overhead cam, you can really see that when I poked my hole, it was not very centered. But this looks good to me. And the first thing I want to do is trim away this overhanging clay. So I'm going to take my trimming tool and then go ahead and start trimming away that until I have a nice clean wall to work with. So this is done at 3 o'clock. And I'm doing the flat side too, and removing a little more. And then because it's kind of sharp, I want to add a little bit of water, so I don't want it to get chipped yet. And I'm just going to gently round that corner out. And I can sharpen this later if I want, but for now I just want to round it out just so it doesn't chip or gouge as I'm moving on to my next steps. Alright, so from here, the outside where that lip was is gone, and now I'm going to separate the lid from the base. So you have to decide when you cut it, are you going to cut it at the bottom flange or the top flange? And for my personal preference, I like doing the bottom because that way the lid has the flange and the base or the bottom of the piece is just a straight cylinder or whatever shape it's going to be. But if you make it the top, then the flange is going to be on the bottom, and it's going to look a little weird if you just look at the base jar itself. So when you cut this, you can either use the needle and cut across at it, like you're cutting your clay wall at the lip, or you can use an X-Acto knife to cut. The benefit of the X-Acto knife, it's much sharper, you'll get a much cleaner cut. However, if you're not stable and steady as you cut into it, this can easily cut up or down because it's so sharp, and you end up creating a spiral cut going up or down depending on how it pulls. So I do recommend using the needle tool when you start off for this. And so when I'm doing this, I'm usually bracing my hands and I'm cutting it right here around 4 o'clock, and I'm slowly pushing the needle tool into the clay body. So from the top camera, you can really see how I do it. And from the straight camera, you can't really see how it looks. So I am actually just going to shift my body so that it's going to be a little easier to see on the camera. so you can see how the needle plays. So I'm going to use the needle. The tip of the needle comes in at a slight angle, and I'm using this flat wall here, this lip, to kind of guide the needle so I only cut into the piece. And you want to make sure you cut little increments at a time, because if you cut too much all at once, this thing might just pop off completely, and then it might get damaged and hit the wall of your splash pad as it spins. So just cut a little increments at a time. So I hold the needle like I normally would in my hand, gripped like this. My left hand also is gripping the right, pressing my hand on the splash pad or your legs, depending on how you are set up to throw. And I'm slowly burring the needle tip into the clay wall right where I want to cut. Okay. And then I give a wiggle test. If I feel it budge, then I know that this is pretty close to being cut all the way through. I don't feel it budge at all, so I'm going to go ahead and start again. And I'm just going to keep pushing the needle more and more into the piece. And keep doing the jiggle test until I feel it kind of shift. And then as I'm going deeper, you can see that my needle is getting a more of an angle. So basically the way I'm cutting is I start from here and I'm slowly pushing the tool across the center rather than stabbing it directly into it. And that way this cut creates less surface friction as it spins around, so the odds of it gripping and ripping are less. But if you stab it in here, there's so much pressure hitting this tip, it might shake or gouge. So this way it takes a little longer to cut, but the odds of you making a mistake are a lot less. Okay, so it is a painstakingly slow process, at least your first round doing this. But once you get used to this technique, you can do this much faster with the X-Acto knife. There we go. So I cut all the way through. So now you can see that I have this really wide lip, this overhanging ledge here, and the same thing's happening on here. So I'm going to have to go ahead and trim both the top and the bottom to make this fit nicely into here. And no cracks on the inside, so those techniques that I did where I dried the lip before I sealed it and poking the hole on the top help prevent it from cracking. So before I get this flipped over and try to fit, or flipped over here and try to center, I want to remove this overhanging clay. So I'm going to put my lid on the side. I'm going to adjust my body back to the center. And I'm left-handed, so lefties get a slight advantage when it comes to trimming this, because all I need to do is take my left hand, push pressure here, and start trimming away this lip at 3 o'clock. But for righties, that's a very awkward way to hold. So for righties, you're going to actually want to hold your trimming tool, and you're going to push it at midnight instead. And this is where you'd want to trim your rim. That's where I would recommend it, and it's a little easier to hold. And as you do it, you're just removing this overhanging clay so there's no lip, so you have a nice vertical wall. And so you're just going to take your time and just keep removing small increments at a time. That's going to create this little lip at the top. You can easily remove that. You can also add a bevel here if you want, and then remove the inside. Okay. The other option is you use the round side. You start from below where the lip is, and you trim upwards. So whatever you feel is more comfortable for you. You may have to use a combination of the two. I'm going to switch back to my left hand because I am left-handed. So I'm going to go ahead and use the flat side now, going up from below the lip and moving it up towards the top. Okay, and now this right here, get rid of that, bevel the lip, and then this outside, clean that up a little bit more. All right, so now this top is more or less set. I'm gonna add some water to it and then round the corners. I don't want it too sharp. Now this is optional. Some people want nice sharp edges, so it's really crisp, but I want it a little more softer. And this bottom is more or less done, but I'm not gonna pop it off just yet because I'm gonna be using this as a chuck so I can trim my top. So my top can go inside here, so I can trim this section. Because this doesn't fit yet. And because it doesn't fit, I gotta trim this to make it fit. So just like we trim using the chuck in the previous videos, we're going to center this as best as possible so that this is level, and we can trim the inside and outside and keep flipping it back and forth until it fits. So center as best as possible. Feel the lip. Every time it rises, that's the point that's the most off center. So this is the high, this is the low, so I want to tilt it so that this drops down a little bit in height, and repeat. So once again, feel where it rises, right here. Shift that to where the middle is, and tilt. Okay, that looks pretty good, feels pretty good. And now at this stage, I do recommend wadding this down so it doesn't shift. You could just apply downwards pressure here and trim if you're very confident. But for first time trying to do this, I do recommend getting some wads, just like how we trimmed using chucks before. Rip it into pieces, roll a coil, pinch the coil to make a little tapered edge, and then stuff it inside. Now I'm going to give one last trick before I actually center this, and I'm just going to use 2 this time. I'm not going to use more than that. We're most likely going to have to flip this and see how it fits inside, and then put it back. So every time we flip it and see if it sizes, if it doesn't fit, we're going to have to flip it and retrim, and we're going to have to recenter, and that might give some issues. So one thing I like to do before I wad it down is I take my needle, and just like as if I'm cutting that to separate, I'm just going to go ahead and then trace a very faint line where this is touching the lid. And that way when I pop this off and put it back on, I know exactly how it fits. And if you want to take it a step further, you can even make some lines here to indicate where they fit. And that way it will kind of help you out when you remove it and put it back. So I got my 2 pieces. Where I made that horizontal line, I'm going to position the wads so it's not in front of it. And then I'm just going to put the tapered edge against the gap and then push this side in, and then repeat doing the other side. Now one thing I forgot to mention, because I'm getting really excited and I wanted to trim this and finish it, is you could use calipers to measure the diameter of the inside of the jar before you center it. So I'll show you how to do that after the fact, because I forgot and already centered it. But anyway, I'm going to trim this edge and then we'll see how it fits. So let's get this pushed down a little bit, get my trimming tool. And then this is a little on the drier side, so I'm going to add just a little bit of water, super little bit. And then this inside, the outside of the flange is where I'm going to have to trim the most for it to fit. So this is where I want to focus most of my trimming. And then the inside, I don't really need to touch this very much. So all I'm going to do is just round this edge. And I don't want to take too much off of this inside because I want this thickness here. Because as I trim all this away from the outside, I'm going to have to keep trimming this away until it fits in here. So if I remove the inside too much, then this will become really thin. So I know that it was quite a difference in thickness, so I'm going to take off a little more than just the overhanging clay. And then this edge here, I want to tidy up. So I'm going to remove a little more from here, and that gives me a taller flange. And I can always cut my flange to make it shorter too. And then right here, I can mess with a little later. Okay, so now this is more or less set up. If you want to adjust this inside, you could do this now or after you're finished completely. So I'm just going to do it now just because I'm already here. And if you want to trim a little bit off of this, you could take a little bit just to kind of clean it up so it doesn't look like it was sealed from the outside. If you want to see more ceramic videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. That way it helps grow the channel and you'll be able to see these videos as they're released every week. And then using a rib or fingers to smooth that up can get a nice cleaner cut. Okay, so let's get rid of the trimmings from the outside. Let's pop these wads off and let's do the test. So let's pick it up. And this is my guideline where I want to center it. If it doesn't fit, and I need to recenter. Oh, and one thing I forgot to do is I just want to round this edge. So I always want to round my corners just so it doesn't risk chipping or gouging as I'm working with the clay. So let's pick it up and see how it fits. Okay, so I'm positioning that line kind of more or less in the center, and I can see that I still have quite more trimming I need to do. So before I recenter this upside down, I actually want to grab my calipers to see the true thickness or width of the bottom, so I know how much I need to take off from the top. So these aluminum tools are called calipers. There's wooden ones, there's plastic ones, there are a lot of different variations, but the metal ones are usually the most common. There is a bolt here, a wing nut that you can then twist to tighten, and you can take your measurements based on the width of your circumference or other measurements that work with this. So what I like doing is I like crossing the tips, so I'm taking the width based on here, and the first thing I want to do is see how wide this inside is, because I need to know how wide the flange needs to be in order to fit. Okay, so that is the width here. And then now when I take that same measurement and I put it across, you can see I need to trim quite a bit. So about 1/8 of an inch more in order for this to fit into here. So what I can do to help me, because that is kind of a lot, I can trim a little more off of here just to save some of the clay, because this is still a good 1/4 inch. And this flange, that way it doesn't get too thin. So I'm going to put the lid on the side, put my wads just inside because I'm going to reuse them anyway. And I'm just going to take a little more off of here, and I want to make sure that when I cut into here, I want my angle, instead of having it straight up and down or angled inward, I want to angle it outwards a little bit, so when I put my lid in here, it fits a little better. So I'm just going to take a little bit more off, especially because the inside, you can see it wobble from the overhead cam. And not much, maybe another 1/16 of an inch, and that way it just helps me to get that lid to fit a little better. Before you recenter your lid on top, if you trim the inside again, make sure you check the width of the opening to get the new measurement, so that when you center, you will more or less know exactly how much you need to remove. And one thing I forgot to mention, if you end up taking more clay from the inside here, this line that you've made actually won't really work because it's going to sit a little differently. So if you end up tracing the line and you take a little more off of this, you may want to erase this line and recenter it from scratch. So from what I just did, to save you guys more time, taking a caliper width from the beginning might save you some headache moving forward. So anyway, let's go ahead and recenter this. Okay, so that feels pretty level. I'm going to mark the line one more time, and this time I do not want to take any more clay off of the bottom, because I want to make sure that line that I just made doesn't need to get adjusted, but I do want to redraw in this other line for centering purposes. Okay, so let's get my wads to secure the sides, and let's get this trimmed to make it fit perfectly. Now let's check the new measurement, and I don't need to take off too much. It's looking like about 1/16 of an inch. So let's get our trimming tools. This time I'm using the bigger one, and that way I can trim a little more off at a faster rate. Now keep in mind, as you are trimming, don't apply too much pressure, so you may want to take a free finger and apply downward pressure, because if you apply too much pressure as you trim, the lid may shift and pop off, and then you're gonna have to recenter it, and that's never fun. Okay, so hopefully I took off enough. Let's see, almost there. So take off a little more. So I start with a bevel, and I turn it, and I trim a little more. Now, most likely this part's going to be a little wider, so this is where you got to make sure it fits and you take enough off. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this edge down. So I want a nice clean edge. It's getting a little on the thinner side, and I got to take a little bit off of the edge right here because I need that to be a nice sharp angle for it to fit nicely. And I can always cut a little more off my flange if I want. But I just need to clean up those edges so I know that this will be able to go all the way down into the base. Okay, looks like it can fit. So when in doubt, you can leave this slightly wider, because if you trim too much here, it's going to have some jiggle as you put on here. And if you leave this slightly wider and it still doesn't fit in the base when you flip it, you can always just remove a little bit more from the base. And because my base is thicker than my flange, that's never a bad thing. So now the moment of truth, let's see if it fits. And it will almost fit. And looking at my angle, this is actually wider than the base. So if I take a little off of that, that actually will make it fit a little better. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove a little more here because the angle here, this is flared out a little bit. If I just trim it straight, it should fit a little better. So let's find my lines and let's trim again. So the only downside of doing this lid and making sure it fits is there's a lot of flipping back and forth if you want to make it precise. Okay, and then recenter. This is where those lines come in handy. I can see where it rises and falls based on the line. Okay, and then add a little bit of water and take a little more off of this part here, and after that it should more or less fit. And because I'm not trimming too much and I'm being very gentle, I don't really need to wad it down, but if you're doing it, it's up to you on how much precaution you want to take. Okay, there we go. Moment of truth again. There we go. It is starting to fit a little better. My angle's still a little odd. So the reason why it's not fitting perfectly is because this flares out a little bit. So I need to take a little more off of the base or the lid. So it's up to you, but it is so close. And because I don't want to take any more off the flange, I am going to just take a little more off from the inside. So add a little water. And little increments at a time. This time a little lower from the top. So a lot of trial and error as you are doing this to make sure it fits. So right there looks pretty good. There is a slight jiggle, but I'm not too worried about that. So I just want to center this as best as possible so that this band right here is more or less even. And then I'm going to give it a light tap. And I'm going to start cleaning up the outside and removing this extra clay here so I don't see that. And then that line I don't need anymore. So remove that. And then now I'm just going to trim this extra clay away from the base. So little increments at a time. And you can trim away as much or as little as you want. And when you add water, just try not to add water between the connection where the lid touches the base, because if you do, it might get this a little stuck and it'll be harder to release. So I'm going to take a little more off of the belly section. And if you wanted a really, really clean finish, you could potentially trim directly on top so that they are perfectly flush. So I'm just going to do a little bit of that. I'm not going to do too much because it creates some weird edges. So that looks good, more or less, for me. And so that looks a lot better, a lot more clean. And the last thing I'm going to do is get my knob attached. Thank you for watching part 2 of this 3-part series. In the third and final video, we're going to get this knob attached, trim the bottom, and finish this jar. If you'd like to watch that, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see it when the video is released. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.